When most people think of Karl Marx, they picture the fiery philosopher, the radical voice of revolution, the co-author of the Communist Manifesto. But away from the pamphlets and political struggles, Marx was also a husband and father, trying to raise a family in some of the harshest conditions Victorian Europe had to offer. In 1849, Karl Marx and his wife Jenny von Westphalen fled to London. They were political refugees, marked as dangerous by governments across Europe. The couple had already lived through exile in Paris and Brussels, but London would become their final home, a place where Karl would write his greatest works, and also where his family would endure some of their darkest struggles. London in the mid-19th century was not a welcoming city for exiles. The Industrial Revolution had filled the city with smoke, noise, and crowded tenements. While the wealthy thrived, families like the Marxes fought daily just to survive. Rent often went unpaid, furniture was pawned to buy food, and hunger was a constant threat. It was in this world that Karl and Jenny raised 7 children. Jenny Caroline, Jenny Laura, Edgar, nicknamed Mush, Henry Edward Guy, Franziska, Eleanor, and possibly Frederick Demuth, who many believe was Karl's illegitimate child, with the family's longtime maid, Helene Demuth. Their small apartment in Soho was often unheated and overcrowded. Karl spent his days in the British Library, working on the theories that would one day shake the world, while Jenny tried to manage the impossible task of keeping her children clothed, fed, and alive. Jenny von Westphalen had been born into Prussian nobility. She gave up her wealth, her family's social standing, and eventually her health in order to stand by Marx. She became the quiet pillar of the household, enduring both financial ruin and the unbearable grief of burying several of her children before they reached adulthood. 7 children were born into exile, and 7 lives were marked by poverty and revolution. Yet only 3 would survive to adulthood, and their individual stories of sacrifice, ambition, and tragedy reveal the hidden cost of being born a Marx. For Karl and Jenny Marx, parenthood was never free from hardship. No sooner had their family begun to grow than tragedy struck again and again. In an age when child mortality was heartbreakingly common, the Marx family was not spared. Poverty, malnutrition, and poor living conditions made survival an uphill battle for their little ones. Their second son, Henry Edward Guy, was born in 1849, but his life was heartbreakingly short. He died before reaching his 2nd birthday. Just 2 years later, in 1851, another daughter, Franziska, joined the family. Yet she too would not live to see more than a year. Illness swept through the cramped Soho apartment, and despite Jenny's desperate attempts to care for her, the tiny child passed away in 1852. Perhaps the greatest blow came with the loss of Edgar, the 3rd child to die young. Nicknamed Mush, Edgar was adored by both parents. Karl was especially attached to him, often writing about the boy's cheerful nature and energy. But in 1855, at just 8 years old, Edgar fell gravely ill with tuberculosis. Despite every effort, he succumbed to the disease. His death devastated Karl, who confessed in his letters that the loss nearly broke him. The fiery revolutionary, known for his sharp pen and iron will, was reduced to a grieving father who found no consolation in words. Within just a few years, Karl and Jenny had buried 3 of their children. The Marx household, already weighed down by hunger and unpaid bills, was now filled with grief. For Karl, who argued that history moved through struggle and sacrifice, these losses revealed the most painful kind of struggle, not that of classes or nations, but of a father helpless against the death of his own children. By the mid-1850s, 4 of the Marx children remained alive: Jenny Caroline, the eldest; Jenny Laura, her younger sister; Eleanor, the youngest daughter; and perhaps Frederick Demuth, who would live outside the family circle. These children would carry forward the Marx name, but not without carrying the scars of their family's painful beginnings. The first of Karl and Jenny Marx's children, Jenny Caroline, often called Jennichen by her family, was born in 1844 while the Marxes were living in exile. As the eldest daughter, much of the responsibility of family life fell onto her shoulders. She grew up surrounded by political debates, radical exiles, and the daily struggles of poverty. Even in her youth, she witnessed the sacrifices her mother made and the endless labor of her father's writing. Despite the family's hardships, Jennichen grew into a determined and intelligent young woman. Like her parents, she inherited a passion for ideas and justice. Her sharp wit and warm personality made her well liked among the Marx family's circle of revolutionaries. She often assisted her father with his manuscripts, serving as a copyist when money was too scarce to hire help. At times, she was not only a daughter but a secretary, confidant and ally to Karl Marx himself. In 1872, Jenny married Charles Longuet, a French journalist and political activist who was active in the socialist movement. Their marriage was not an escape from hardship, but a continuation of the revolutionary life she had always known. Together they had several children, and Jenny devoted herself to raising them, while also standing beside her husband in political struggles. But life remained difficult. Jenny suffered from poor health for much of her adult years. Letters from the period reveal her bouts of exhaustion and illness, yet she continued to take on the heavy load of family and political work. Her deep sense of duty carried her forward, even as her strength declined. In 1883, at the age of only 38, Jenny Caroline died of bladder cancer, just 2 months after her father Karl Marx passed away. Her death was a cruel blow to the family. Jenny's mother, already grieving the loss of her husband, now buried her eldest child as well. Friends remembered Jenny as spirited, intelligent and unfailingly loyal, but also as another victim of the relentless hardship that seemed to haunt the Marx household. Her children carried on the Longuet name in France, continuing in socialist politics, but Jenny's early death cut short a life that had already been tested by more suffering than many endure in a lifetime. For Karl Marx's eldest daughter, being born into revolution meant living a life of struggle, sacrifice, and ultimately, an untimely end. The second daughter of Karl and Jenny Marx, Jenny Laura, was born in 1845, just a year after her sister Jenny. Like her siblings, Laura grew up in exile, surrounded by the poverty and instability that marked the Marx family's life in London. But she also inherited her parents' fierce sense of political conviction. From an early age, Laura was immersed in the revolutionary world, translating works, attending meetings, and absorbing the debates that filled their cramped Soho apartment. Laura's adult life became closely tied to another well-known socialist, Paul Lafargue, a Cuban-born activist of French descent who became one of Karl Marx's most devoted disciples. The two married in 1868 with Marx's blessing. Their union was more than a personal partnership. It was a political alliance. Together they lived in France, working side by side in the socialist movement. Paul became a prominent writer and theorist, while Laura worked tirelessly at his side, both as a collaborator and as a steadying presence in their shared revolutionary household. But the Lafargues' devotion to the cause came at a price. Financial insecurity followed them throughout their lives, and while they carried the Marx name with pride, they also carried the burden of expectation, the weight of living up to one of history's most famous fathers. Laura's letters show a woman both determined and weary, loyal to her husband and her father's legacy, but often battling exhaustion and disillusionment. By the turn of the 20th century, Laura and Paul had grown older, but remained steadfast in their beliefs. Then in 1911, after more than 4 decades of marriage, the couple made a startling decision. In their 60s and facing the decline of age, they wrote a joint letter declaring their wish to leave the world before frailty overcame them. Shortly after, they carried out a suicide pact. Laura was 66 years old when she died alongside her husband. Their death shocked the socialist community. To some, it was a tragic end for 2 lifelong fighters. To others, it was the ultimate act of control, a final statement that they would not let life's decline dictate their last chapter. For Karl Marx's second daughter, Jenny Laura, her life was defined by unwavering devotion to her family, to her husband, and to the revolutionary ideals she had been raised with. But it ended as it had been lived, in struggle, sacrifice, and a decision that still raises questions more than a century later. The youngest daughter of Karl and Jenny Marx, Eleanor, was born in 1855. Known affectionately as Tussie, she was adored by her family. Bright, curious, and full of energy, she quickly became the intellectual spark of the household. Even as a child, Eleanor absorbed languages and ideas with ease, and she grew up at the center of the Marx family's radical world. Unlike her older sisters, who often carried the burdens of domestic responsibility, Eleanor was encouraged to pursue her studies and her passions. She became fluent in multiple languages, translating major works of literature into English, including Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. But her true calling was politics. By the time she was a young woman, Eleanor had become a powerful voice in the growing socialist movement, often speaking at rallies and meetings. Audiences were struck by her eloquence and charisma. She seemed to embody the revolutionary fire of her father, combined with her own keen insight into women's rights and social justice. Eleanor was not only a political activist, but also an early feminist. She argued for women's equality within the labor movement, insisting that socialism without gender equality was incomplete. She became a leading figure in Britain's emerging socialist organizations, and her speeches drew large crowds. Many saw her as the rightful heir to her father's intellectual legacy. But Eleanor's private life was far more troubled than her public one. She fell deeply in love with Edward Aveling, a fellow socialist activist and writer. Aveling was brilliant, but also notorious for his selfishness, infidelity, and financial irresponsibility. Despite warnings from friends and family, Eleanor remained devoted to him. Their relationship was turbulent and often destructive, yet she clung to him with unwavering loyalty. By the late 1890s, Eleanor's life had become overshadowed by heartbreak. Aveling had betrayed her yet again, and whispers of his secret marriage to another woman devastated her. The strain of political battles combined with her personal despair became too much to bear. On March 31st, 1898, at the age of just 43, Eleanor Marx took her own life by swallowing poison. Her death shocked the socialist community, leaving her comrades stunned and grieving. To many, Eleanor had seemed unstoppable. The brilliant daughter of Karl Marx, a passionate advocate for workers and women, a rising star in international socialism. Her tragic end revealed the fragile humanity behind the legend. She was remembered not only as a revolutionary, but also as a woman undone by love and betrayal. In Eleanor, the world saw both the brilliance and the vulnerability of the Marx family. She carried the torch of her father's ideals further than any of his children. But her story ended as so many of theirs did, with tragedy. Amid the struggles and sorrows of the Marx household, there is one figure who stands apart. A child whose very existence was hidden in whispers and speculation. His name was Frederick Demuth, and to this day, historians continue to debate whether he was in fact Karl Marx's son. Frederick was born in 1851 to Helene Lenchen Demuth, the devoted maid and lifelong companion of the Marx family. Helene had been given to Jenny Marx as a household servant by her mother, and became a fixture in the household for decades. She raised the children, kept the home together through years of poverty, and was fiercely loyal to the Marxes. But in 1851, she gave birth to a boy. The father of that child was never officially acknowledged. For many years, Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx's closest friend and collaborator, claimed paternity, publicly taking responsibility for the child. But scholars have long suspected that it was Karl Marx himself who fathered Frederick, and that Engels had offered to shield his friend's reputation by stepping forward. Engels never married, and his sacrifice may have been an act of loyalty that kept Marx's public image intact. Whatever the truth, Frederick Demuth grew up outside the Marx family circle. He was placed in the care of a working-class family in London and lived as a labourer, never benefiting from the intellectual fame or networks of his supposed father. Unlike Marx's daughters, who inherited his world of books and politics, Frederick lived a life defined by toil and obscurity. He became a machinist and a trade union member, but his connection to Marx was never openly recognized during his lifetime. Frederick's story represents a painful irony. If he was indeed Marx's son, then the philosopher who wrote passionately about the struggles of the working class had a child who lived and died as one of those very workers, largely ignored by his father. Frederick never rose to prominence, never carried the Marx name, and lived his life on the margins of history. He died in 1929, long after the rest of Marx's children had passed. His life was quiet and uncelebrated, in stark contrast to the fame of the man who may have fathered him. Today, his story is often told as a footnote in the Marx family's saga, but it raises deep questions about loyalty, secrecy, and the price of reputation. In Frederick Demuth, we see the shadow side of Karl Marx's legacy, the son left behind, whose existence was hidden in order to protect the myth of the revolutionary father. Behind every revolution, there are often quiet figures who bear the hidden weight of history. For Karl Marx, that figure was his wife, Jenny von Westphalen. Born in 1814 into a respected Prussian aristocratic family, Jenny came from privilege and refinement. She could have chosen a life of comfort, wealth, and social standing. Instead, she tied her fate to a radical thinker with little money and endless political enemies. Jenny and Karl married in 1843 after a long courtship that defied her family's expectations. From that moment, she became not only a wife but a comrade in arms, following Marx into exile after exile. Paris, Brussels, Cologne, and finally London. Every move meant clothes to buy food, and at times even begged friends for small loans just to keep her children alive. Life in London was particularly harsh. The Marx family lived in cramped apartments, often damp and cold. Illness was constant. Jenny managed the household under impossible conditions, burying 3 of her children in small graves before they had a chance to grow up. Yet she rarely complained in public. In letters, she sometimes confessed her despair. The humiliation of sending her children to school poorly dressed, the pain of seeing them go hungry, but she remained loyal to Karl's cause. She was more than a caretaker. Jenny also became her husband's intellectual partner. She edited his manuscripts, copied his endless notes, and critiqued his drafts. In a way, she was his first reader and most trusted critic. Without her, much of Marx's work might never have reached the page in finished form. But years of sacrifice wore her down. By the 1870s, Jenny's health began to fail. She suffered from recurring illness, and by 1881 she was diagnosed with cancer. In December of that year, she passed away at the age of 67, leaving Karl a widow. 2 years later, he would follow her to the grave. Jenny von Westphalen's story is often overshadowed by her husband's fame, yet her role was indispensable. She endured poverty, loss, and exile with extraordinary resilience. She gave up a life of privilege to share in Karl Marx's struggle, and in doing so, she became the quiet pillar of the Marx family. Without Jenny's endurance, it is doubtful that Marx's revolutionary ideas could have been written or preserved at all. Her life reminds thus that history is not only shaped by the men who write books or lead movements, but also by the women who sacrifice everything to keep them alive. Karl Marx is often remembered as a stern, bearded revolutionary whose writings shook the foundations of economics and politics. But within the cramped walls of his Soho apartment, he was not only a philosopher, but also Papa Marx. His letters and the memories of his children reveal a side of him that history books rarely show. A man full of humor, affection, and tenderness for his family. Marx could be playful, writing little jokes and teasing nicknames for his daughters. Eleanor, the youngest, recalled how he called her Tussie, and often told her stories at night, mixing fantasy with political satire. To his children, he wasn't a distant intellectual, but a father who found joy in their laughter. Even in the midst of financial hardship, Marx would try to lighten the mood with songs, poems, or a game. He also took pride in their intellect. When his daughters helped him copy and edit his manuscripts, he treated them not simply as helpers, but as trusted collaborators. In his eyes, they were part of the revolutionary project, partners in the work that consumed his life. His daughters, especially Eleanor, admired him deeply and often referred to him as their guide and mentor, as much as their father. Yet Marx was also deeply sensitive to their suffering. The deaths of his children weighed heavily on him. When Edgar, little Mush, had died at the age of 8, Marx confessed in letters that he could barely go on. Friends wrote that it was the only time they had ever seen him truly broken. For all his writings on the struggles of humanity, the loss of his own son left him powerless and devastated. Marx's life was riddled with contradictions. Publicly, he was the great revolutionary locked in battles of theory and politics. Privately, he was a father who struggled to feed his children, a husband who relied on his wife's sacrifices, and a man who loved his daughters fiercely. In a world that often reduced him to a political icon, his family saw him as a man full of warmth, flaws, and love. Understanding Marx as a father helps us see the human being behind the revolutionary. His children were not simply bystanders to his philosophy. They lived it, suffered it, and carried it with them, each in their own way. And in the rare moments of peace, they also shared in the laughter and affection of a father who, for all his radicalism, wanted nothing more than for his children to be happy. To be the child of Karl Marx was to live with both privilege and burden. On one hand, the Marx family carried a name that would shape world history. On the other, that same name cast a shadow so large that none of the children could ever truly escape it. From their earliest days, the Marx daughters were immersed in political debates. Their home was a gathering place for revolutionaries, exiles, and intellectuals. They learned to speak multiple languages, to read widely, and to think critically. But outside their cramped apartment, the name Marx was not always a blessing. It was a mark of danger. Authorities in Europe kept close watch, and neighbors in London sometimes regarded the family with suspicion. Poverty and stigma followed them at every turn. As adults, the daughters carried their father's ideas into their own lives, but the association often made things harder. Jenny, the eldest, struggled to maintain stability while living in the shadow of her father's reputation. had devoted herself to socialism in France, but both she and her husband were always compared to Karl himself. Eleanor, the youngest, was seen as the intellectual heir, and though she carved her own space in politics, she could never escape comparisons to the old man. The shadow wasn't just political, it was personal. Karl Marx's towering intellect and uncompromising nature set a standard that was impossible for his children to match. They adored him, but they also lived in the long echo of his brilliance. For each of them, their father's legacy was both inspiration and burden. The tragedies that befell the family, early deaths, poverty, heartbreak, were compounded by this shadow. It meant that even in their most private struggles, the weight of Karl Marx's name was always present. Every choice they made, every path they followed was measured against the expectations of being the children of Marx. And yet, in their own ways, each of them kept that revolutionary spirit alive. Whether through writing, activism, or even quiet resilience, the Marx children lived under the shadow of revolution, a shadow that shaped their identities, their destinies, and their tragedies. When we step back and look at the lives of Karl Marx's children, we find a story filled with brilliance, sacrifice, and sorrow. None of them lived easy lives. They were born into poverty, raised in exile, and carried the burden of a name that would change the world, but offered them little protection in their own time. Jennichen, the eldest, tried to balance family and politics but died too young. Nora gave her life to socialism in France, only to end it in a pact with her husband. Eleanor, the most gifted, carried her father's flame further than any of them, only to be undone by heartbreak. Frederick Demuth, the forgotten son, lived and died in obscurity, hidden in the margins of history. Even those who did not survive childhood, Edgar, Heinrich, Franziska, left their mark in the grief that shaped their parents' lives. Each child's fate is a reminder that behind the towering figure of Karl Marx stood a family that paid the real cost of his revolutionary struggle. And yet, their stories also remind us of resilience. The daughters who fought for socialism and women's rights, the son who labored quietly in the working class, the mother who sacrificed everything for her husband's vision. Together they form a tapestry of lives lived in the shadow of an idea. Today, history remembers Karl Marx as one of the most influential thinkers of all time. But the story of his children adds depth to that legacy. It shows us the human cost of revolution, the sacrifices that history books often leave untold. It also reveals the ways in which ideals are carried forward, not only in books and movements, but in the struggles of families who live them every day. The Marx children were not just footnotes in their father's biography. They were individuals with hopes, dreams, loves, and tragedies of their own. Their lives may not have reshaped the world in the way Karl's writings did, but their stories remind us that even the greatest revolutions are built on human lives, fragile, fleeting, and profoundly real. As we close the book on their stories, one truth remains. The legacy of the Marx children is not only one of tragedy, but also of testament. A testament to resilience, to the cost of ideals, and to the enduring shadow of a name that changed the course of history.